Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and having me over today, even though it was a very short notice. I'm also sad that Paco cannot be here, so I even text him to see if he could join us, but he's actually not capable, physically capable to do that. And I'm saying sad because even though it's true that Paco and I have written together papers on this topic and plan cognition and plan sentience, we have different views about that. I think Paco's more optimistic than me about plan sentience or about the whole topic of sentience in general. So basically, what I did today is I want to give you some overview of the debate about cognition and sentience in plants. Obviously, as you can expect, the research is still nascent and very much shaky in a way. So we can have like very complex discussions as the one that Susana just presented. But I hope I can give you like a an overview of the state of the debate and the different positions that are being uh, exposed now in the literature. So, oops, I think I lost. Well, okay, what? That's fine. Well, I'm going to start talking about the philosophy of plan cognition and sentience and what's the context here. So, using the context, I use it. I like to frame it as part of comparative cognition. So, comparative cognition, I give you some covers of the books I like the most about comparative cognition, including Susana's book on Schrodinger possum. I don't know if it's in English yet. It should be soon, I guess. We should consider plants as part of the comparative cognition debate. And as you can imagine, for historical reasons, comparative cognition is both very anthropocentric and also self-centric. And I'm happy to debate this claim with you. But then the question we're interested in is, okay, what can plant tells us about the nature of cognition? So what can we learn studying the behavior of plants? And this question that looks very crazy and new actually dates back to Darwin. So there's these books, for example, this one by co-written by Charles and his son Francis, when they were already observing the behavior of plants and trying to compare that with that of animals. So it's not really that new. And I think that if we read this book, we find very interesting reasons as to why plants should be considered, if only to discard them. So I am not saying that we should assume from the beginning that plants are cognitive. What I'm saying is that we might learn something useful about cognition by studying plants as well. So in this context, what we favor is what I like to call a naturalistic approach to plant cognition and sentience. So, and this in the context of the Minimal Intelligence Lab, which is basically a lab in the philosophy department that is composed by scientists or biologists. We have ecologists, behavioralists, plant physiologists, etc. Carry on experiments, and also philosophers. It's actually led by a philosopher, by Paco. And then the question I always get when I say that is, okay, yeah, but what do philosophers do in this? What can philosophers bring to discussion? And I think that in general, we can distinguish two different, very clear contributions. One is conceptual. So we can address conceptual issues. For example, can be part of the discussion of what is cognition or what is sentience. Also, what do we mean when we say that an organism is cognitive or intelligent or sentient? But we can also address methodological issues. So, for example, how can we study and compare the behavior of different organisms to determine whether they are cognitive or sentient? What biases may we incur when we do comparative cognition? So, in the last years, the philosophers, especially Christian Andrews, which is one of my favorite philosophers ever, has been very good identifying different biases that we might incur when we do comparative cognition, from anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, anthropofabulation, anthropectomy, and most recently, weird-centrism, in collaboration with Susana, by the way. And then so how this principle manifests in practice, right? So how do we make this philosophical naturalism real at MINLA? So first of all, we defend that we should promote the empirical investigation of plant behavior, first in lab and ecological valid context, and with methods suitable for plants. So for example, the methods we use are usually time-lapse photography and plant electrophysiology. Also, we need to adopt a comparative and a piecemeal approach. So as a philosopher, I'm very skeptical of questions like what is cognition, what is mind, what is blah, blah, blah. I don't think those questions are useful, and I don't think those questions invite a realistic answer. Instead, I think that we should go case by case and behavioral, so cognitive trait by cognitive traits. For example, what behavioral traits are required to attribute X, being X, perception, learning, decision making, to an organism? So what kind of things should we observe in order to attribute this cognitive trait to an organism? And then, do plants exhibit those behavioral traits? So what I'm basically saying is that why don't we start by comparative cognition doing in animals, and then we see if there is something similar in plants. Also, we have to avoid anthropocentric and zoocentric definitions of key concepts, for example, the concept of behavior, but also avoid idiosyncratic definitions too. And this is actually very interesting because when we talk about cognitive behavior, one of the problems we find is that the notion of behavior that we use with plants is not very clearly assimilable to the notion of behavior used in animals. So plants don't locomote. Plants move, so to speak, by the developmental plasticity. And then if we want to call this behavior, we need to make a case for that. So we cannot simply assume that, because the risk we may incur is that we will be crossing each other. So we will be just talking about different things. So there's no real possibility of a comparative cognitive science. So again, I think we should avoid anthropocentrism and zoocentrism, but also idiosyncratic plant-centric definitions of key concepts. Then, given these preliminary ideas, I want to jump into the empirical evidence about plant behavior or plant cognitive behavior. And I would like to discuss it with you. I'm going to give you some examples of experiments. The experiments that I think that are more interesting are also the ones that have more robust empirical results. So one topic here is decision making. So decision making, usually when we talk about decision making, when an organism selects between alternative courses of actions, and also this selection is not random, but it's based on an evaluation of different alternatives in light of some collective information. So basically, we talk about decision making in contrast to inflexible behavior, so hardwired reaction to significant environmental cues. And I say that because something you usually encounter when you speak about decision making in plants is people tell you, well, but they don't make decisions. They're triggered by environmental stimuli. They are reactive organisms. And I say, well, let's see what the empirical evidence says. First, this example, like the sea maize or corn. So for example, this example, this experiment by Yokawa and colleagues, basically they were growing corn in an inverted Y maze. And then the idea is that when we do that, then the roots can grow in one arm or the other. And then, as you can expect, in the absence of any volatiles, the roots will exhibit no preference. So we have a roughly 50-50 chance of going to arm A or arm B. However, when you introduce a gradient of volatiles, then you see that the roots start being repelled or attracted. And also the interesting thing is that this go-no-go decisions is sensitive to different combinations of chemicals. So it's not really that the presence of one will trigger the presence of another, but you see that different combinations of them will trigger different responses. Also, interestingly, and this in a paper by Elkakim and colleagues, you see that they are also sensitive to competition. So if you introduce also a variable for competition, for example, if you give them to environment to choose, they choose to grow in the arm with less competition. And also, the thing is that if we force them to grow in the arm with more competition, then they will grow more shoots to override the competitor. So you find that when you introduce different variables, the plant is different developmental responses, different plasticity to adapt to that, and they do it in a combinatorial way. Also, we have the example from the velvet leaf, the Abutilon theoprasti. And basically, when you grow them together, so two of them together, you in an environment that the availability of nutrients is more or less homogeneous, you see that they avoid each other. The roots avoid each other. So they avoid foraging in patches with competitors. However, if you introduce a nutrient-rich patch in the middle, then you will go that they override the usual avoidance behavior, and they will go towards this high-quality region. So you see that they can override the natural tendencies if conditions are changed in a way that is favorable for that. We have this example from Calamagrostis canadensis, which is a clonal plant. And then when you offer them adjacent habitats to grow, they choose habitats with the best conditions in terms of competition, warmth, and light. And again, the interesting thing is that they can discriminate conditions in combination. For example, they will choose light plus warm soil in preference to others. So they will you can alter them, you can combine the different environments and see that there's a preference on what they choose. Also, we find this at the level of the stomata. So stomata, if you know, that there's cell structures in the epidermis of the leaf that are involved in the exchange of carbon dioxide and water between the plant and the atmosphere, and they're very important for the survival of plants. So basically, on sunny days or in hot conditions, so opening the stomata supplies the plant with carbon dioxide, which is essential for photosynthesis. However, and there's the risk, so opening the stomata allows for the water inside the plant to evaporate. So there is actually a risk of dehydration. So if the conditions are too extreme, then opening the stomata too much will lead to dehydration and then to death. So what we find is that usually aperture of the stomata depends on a balance between those conditions. So they will open depending on a way that is adaptive to the environmental conditions. And the most interesting thing here is that, for example, if you have plants that have lived through a sustained period of drought, they will produce some stress signals, stress chemicals, and they will retain them so that in subsequent exposures, they will adapt their behavior. So they actually enhance their water efficiency and resilience to drought based on prior experience, based on chemical signals and chemical substances they have produced as a consequence of this exposure. So again, we have here a behavior that is adaptive, that is flexible, but also is adaptive in the long term. So it can, I wouldn't be sure if we want to call that learning, and that's something that we need to discuss, but it's at least adaptive and leaves a trace, a mark for the future in a way. Another interesting topic, at least for me, is anticipation, right? So there's a quote by Fred Adams, who is a philosopher, who is not a friend of this idea of plant cognition. But then in a paper, he says, well, if a system has the capacity to anticipate what is going to happen in this environment, that sounds like the right kind of capacity to be a cognitive capacity. And then, okay, let's see what we find about that. So we have this example from Arabidopsis thaliana, which is one of the most used plants in labs. This paper by Lian Zhang, basically they grew series of Arabidopsis thaliana in pots that contain different salt regimes or disposed vertically from low concentration of salt to high concentration of salt. And then what they found is that at the beginning, obviously, so the roots start growing downwards, so normal gravitropic behavior of roots. But then they found out that roots start bending upwards before the concentration of salt is harmful. So when they pass from the low concentration regime to the medium concentration regime, they start bending upwards, even though they could survive in the medium one. So the medium one is still manageable. It's not disruptive to the metabolic of the plant yet. However, they start bending upwards. They start correcting their natural gravitropic behavior. So from these, Lian Zhang conclude that the roots can sense ion gradients in the growing environment and make decisions that enable roots to stay away from high salt. So plants could survive in the medium agar, but when they pass from the low to the medium, they start growing upward. So it seems that they are not responding to the actual conditions, but to the comparison between both. Also, there's a very interesting example from Denner and colleagues in 2016. So basically what they did is that they split the roots of Pisum sativum, which is basically the garden pea, and they grew them in pots with different nutrient regimes. So one is static, so one is receiving the same amount of nutrients all the time, and the other one is variable, but increasing. So it starts being lower than the stable one, but growing. And then the interesting thing they found is that when the static pot provides enough nutrients to meet the metabolic needs of the plant, then the plant will grow more biomass, more roots in the static one. However, if the nutrients in the static one are not enough, then the plants will grow more roots in the variable one. And even so, even in cases where the variable one is poorer in absolute terms than the static one. So given that the static one doesn't allow for survival, it will go to the variable one, even if the variable one is still not enough. So remember that the variable one starts lower but keeps increasing. And I said this experiment is interesting because it can be analyzed through something that is called risk sensitivity theory. So risk sensitivity theory is a theory that is used in theories of decision making, in psychology and comparative cognition, to model and to understand what is called rational decision making. So the idea is that the theory predicts that it will be an inflection point at which the switch between risk averse, which will be like growing more biomass in the stable pot, in which switching between risk averse behavior to risk prone behavior maximize fitness. So there's a point in which it's rational to opt for the risk prone behavior. So for example, we know that rats prefer to forage at constant food supply source if they are able to meet their energy requirements. However, they will switch to risk prone foraging behavior when the constant food supply source does not meet or doesn't fulfill the daily energy requirements. So if they cannot feed themselves in the constant food supply, they will go to another food supply, which is riskier, maybe because there's risk of predation, things like that. And you can model that with a function, which is the function of the theory, and you can predict the point at which the switch should take place if the model is rational according to the principles of the theory. And the thing is that you can do that with the data gathered by their own colleagues. And the conclusion is that, well, the study demonstrates that theories of decision making and optimal behavior developed for animals and humans can be applied to plants as well. So these are very good and probably one of the only examples that are comparative in a robust sense. So they are taking a theory that is used in human beings and animals to describe and predict rational decision making, and they use it in plants. And it works. You can do that, and plants behave as rational decision makers in this example. Also, I mean, there are many other examples of plant so-called cognitive behavior that I will not discuss because it would be too far. So, for example, we have selective and flexible mimicry, so from Giannoli. Also, we have examples of numerosity, so the ability of plants to track the amount of events. For example, there is one very famous example with Venus flytrap, that they are able to count the amount of mechanical stimulation that they receive in the hairs inside the plants before triggering the digestion response, for example. Examples of swarm intelligence, although there is, and I think we can actually problematize those examples. So the thing is that examples of swarm intelligence in plant are usually with the roots of one plant. But then I think Thais has a point there when say, well, they cannot be compared to beehives, for example, where we have different individuals. So in roots of plants, there's only one individual. In beehives, we have different individuals. So I think we can cast reasonable doubts about whether this would constitute swarm intelligence or not. Also, we have a lot of examples from communication that inter and intraspecies. So, I mean, I leave all the references there if you want to see them. So there are many instances of people talking about cognitive behavior in plants that I think are interesting enough and they should be considered, in my opinion. Also, there is a relatively recent research program that tries to look for the internal mechanisms or the internal underpinnings of these cognitive behaviors in plants. It's called, basically use the label of plant neurobiology. I think the label is, I know the label is quite controversial. Mostly, I mean, obviously plants don't have neurons or nervous system. People are very into this debate. Paco is very active in this debate, defending why we should keep the label. I don't have a particular stake on that. I mean, we can discuss about it later. But there's true that there's some interesting findings in the last years. Also, I bring Fred Adams again, so this idea that, well, if one attributes cognition to plants, one must be prepared to find the mechanisms to support such attributions. And then this is what people in plant neurobiology are trying to do. So they basically use techniques of electrophysiology to uncover the ways that plant collects, transmit, and integrate information among different structures. So again, if you have examples of decision making that in which the organism and the plant is combining different different environmental states, it's reasonable to expect that this information needs to be integrated somehow and somewhere. And this is what defenders of plant electrophysiology or defenders of plant neurobiology using electrophysiological techniques are trying to cover. Obviously, plants do not have brains or neurons. We have said that. However, we know that their vascular systems have cells capable of electrical signaling and transmission, and maybe they contribute to the emergence of cognitive behavior. And I say maybe because we are still investigating that, or people are still investigating that. There's a very interesting paper that came out in 2021 from Miguel Tomé and Rodolfo Ginás, where they actually make a thorough review of all the empirical evidence in plant neurobiology, and they defend the idea that we should broaden the definition of nervous system, including the vascular system of plants. And the argument is very interesting from a comparative cognition perspective, because what they are saying is that we would be able to understand better what a nervous system, how nervous system contributes to cognition if we compare that to this other system that is not nervous, that does not have neurons, but that contributes maybe in a similar way to the same kind of behaviors. So basically, the idea is that we can find, or the hypothesis that we can find functional similarities to animal nervous system in the vascular system of plants. And they have coined this notion of phytonervous system. Again, Paco is very involved in this debate. I keep it here. I bring it here for your consideration. So basically, that this is the vascular system of plants, the xylem and phloem, and basically things that we know, things that we have found. So first of all, we know that plants produce action potentials with the same threefold phases, the polarization, depolarization, hyperpolarization, as animal produced action potentials. And we also know that action potential in plants are involved in some functions, regulated some functions. For example, respiration, photosynthesis, and the movement of organs. Also, so for example, there is a all example of this with Mimosa pudica. So Mimosa pudica is this plant. I don't know if you are seeing my mouse. So basically, Mimosa pudica is a plant that's very famous because if you touch the leaves, they will fall. And it's a very, very, very interesting example. And then you can find actually that this behavior or this response is mediated by the production of action potentials. So there's actually we know of some examples where action potential actually are involved in the regulation of some behavioral responses. Also, we know that so for example, I'm going to say, so the electrical signals are transmitted in the membrane of the cells, complex net bundles of phloem, xylem, and cambium. And in the fact that when we will consider, we see that the vascular system acts effectively as an interorganism long-distance communication system, the same way as nervous systems. So we have there a functional similarity that is robust enough, according, for example, to Miguel Tomé and Rodolfo Ginás. Also, we have found molecules that are used as neurotransmitters in animals, so acetylcholine, GABA, etc. But the thing is that, and we need to be cautious here, is that we don't know yet the function of these chemicals playing in plant behavior. So we don't know what role they have in the behavior of plants. So we don't know if they are actually neurotransmitters as well or not. So far, there's no conclusive evidence on this. So knowing this, I think it's reasonable that we consider that plants are capable of some cognitive behavior. I truly believe this hypothesis is not weird, is not too extreme, and it's not too crazy. But again, I'm happy to discuss it with you. Then we jump to the topic of sentience. As I said, so Paco and I have written a couple of papers together. So this paper that came out in Wires in 2021, and then this second paper in Animal Sentience, where we talk about plant sentience. And I say that because we have received a lot of criticism of people attacking us for defending plant sentience, and I challenge all of them to show me where in the paper we say that plants are sentient. We never said that. All we say, and it's a very modest claim in my opinion, is that we think plant sentience is a hypothesis that is worth exploring. And again, I think it's a hypothesis that is worth exploring, even if we end up rejecting it, because we will be able to learn something about sentience in human and non-human organisms. So we will be able to learn something about what sentience is, what sentience requires. So again, all we say is that sentience is plant sentience is worth exploring. Very humble, I think, but still some people react in a very aggressive and crazy way, in my opinion. So, as we have seen, in the last years, we are seeing how more non-human animal species are being considered sentient. So we started with apes and mammals, birds, reptiles, fishes, octopuses, decapods. And it's not surprising. I mean, the debate on sentience is very important and has very important ethical consequences, as Susanna brilliantly exposed in her talk. However, and I'm going to introduce a list of howevers now. So why I am skeptical about this debate? What are the problems, the main problems I see in this debate? First of all, as you will know, so sentience is a very contested notion. So depending on where you look for, you will find different approaches. So Paco and I tend to use a very deflationary approach, especially sentience, the capacity of an organism or even a system to have felt states, so including sensory experiences and be them external and internal, right? So I think it's a very uncontroversial and minimal notion of sentience. And the problem is that the scientific study of non-human sentience, or animal or non-animal, doesn't matter, is very challenging because we lack direct evidence. So we cannot observe felt states, to the point that many comparative psychologists and many comparative cognitive scientists disregard the study of sentience. I mean, if you go to many of the books that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk on comparative cognition, you won't find chapters on sentience. The only exception is Christine Andrews. So she's the only one that I know that spends a reasonable portion of her book talking about sentience, but not so Saddleworth or Cliff Wine. This is not something that you find. And when you find, it's mostly dismissal. It's like, yeah, we don't know what to say about this. We don't know how to study. Therefore, we should be able to have a science without talking about sentience. And this, I'm almost quoting actually Sarah Saddleworth on that. So the most that researchers can have is that they might rely on some sort of indirect evidence. So it can be behavioral markers, or there can be some correlated electrochemical activity. The problem is that, okay, this, what Mason calls this leap from observable behavior and physiological process to conjecture about private conscious experiences requires some justification. And the problem comes here. So what justifies us in taking some behavioral marker or electrochemical activity as a proxy or as an indicator of sentience? And I think that Christine Andrews is right here when she says that most researchers rely on sort of a reasoning by analogy. And some of them is actually a human-centric analogy. So an example of this is, well, if a behavior that occurs when humans experience pain is also observed in other species, so that's some kind of extreme aversive behavior to a stimulus that we know is noxious, we might infer that there too is accompanied by experience of pain. So if I see my dog fleeing some sort of fire, for example, I can reasonably infer that my dog is able to experience pain as I am, right? However, well, first of all, and Susanna I mentioned before, we can never be sure that the analogous behavior is accompanied by a subjective experience. For example, we know that some organisms respond to damaging stimulus by nociception, and nociception is insentient. So you don't need pain to respond to a noxious stimulus if you have nociception. Actually, nociception is actually a very useful mechanism in learning, as she mentioned. So it's not really clear that even those cases that look very, very obvious can be problematized in a way. Also, the thing is that the analogy might be convincing when members of the ape clade and some other hominid mammals, non-hominid mammals, sorry, but it loses some strength, I think, when the target species become more distant from our. So, for example, I could ask, okay, what kind of behavior should they take as indicative of sentience or of pain in fruit flies? How can I know if I see a fruit fly if it's feeling pain for flies or C. elegans or, you know. And there's also a very, sorry, sorry, very interesting quote from Christian. You said, well, if there are conscious entities that do not behave like humans, and if there is consciousness that we cannot perceive, then those entities will be unjustly excluded. Quite different beings may fail to meet those criteria while still being conscious. So here, I think what Christian is doing is reminding us that reasoning by analogy has limits, and we should be able to think that other species might be sentient, even though they don't respond to non-conscious stimuli in the same way as we do. And I bring it here because when I say that plant sentience is worth exploring, I'm also talking about that. Maybe species that are completely alien to us have their own experience of the world. And I said, maybe. It's a hypothesis that we should discuss. And I think the same rationality applies to neurophysiology of evidence. So there's no, in my opinion, there's no in principle reason to deny that radically different neural structure could give rise to felt states. And I say that because many people suggest that to have sentience, you need to have a centralized nervous system. And I'm not sure about that. Again, this means a kind of a hypothetical, even an argument based on intuition. But I still think it has some traction, has some legs. So, given those preliminary considerations, the question you may ask is, okay, what about plants? What do we know about plants? Here I'm going to introduce you to a couple of arguments or a couple of proposals that have been introduced in the literature about plant sentience. So one of concern the cognitive behavior of plants. So the idea is that, okay, or the question is, okay, is the cognitive behavior of plants that we have reviewed so far indicative of sentience? And here we find different answers. For example, Bennett says that no, it's not indicative. But his argument is quite strong. He says, well, cognition would not be possible evidence for plant sentience in itself. And indeed, no amount of evidence for plant cognition would ever be evidence for sentience, which is something fundamentally different. So the idea is that no, cognition and sentience are fundamentally different. So no, doesn't matter what you show me about cognition, will never convince me of sentience. My friend says, but then what? What do you need to see to speak about sentience? So if we take Bennett very seriously, the risk is that we make sentience a topic that is impossible to investigate. Because what I said at the beginning, because we don't have and we can't have direct empirical evidence of felt states. There are other more nuanced positions. Well, not all cognitive behaviors are indicative of sentience, but some. For example, some researchers have proposed that some instances of associative learning could be reliably and rigorously linked to sentience, especially instances of associative behavior that involves noxious stimuli, like learning to avoid cages after being electrocuted, things like that. And then the question is, okay, what about plants? Well, in the last years, we have seen a lot of debate sparked by a paper published by Monica Gagliano in 2016, I think, that claim to have demonstrated that some plants, in this case, Pisum sativum, like garden pea, are able to learn by association. You can actually teach, or they can learn by Pavlovian condition, classic condition. This, as I said, there's a lot of debate concerning whether the experiment was well done or not. Well, here in Mill Lab, we are trying to replicate that. And for some of which, there's a very famous that came out, a paper that came out very recently by Adi, Charles Ramson, Pago, where they basically find 11 issues, both in the original experiment by Gagliano and colleagues and in the replication by Markle. So they basically identify 11 ways in which the experiment is problematic and also propose ways to improve or to get rid of those problems. So what I'm saying here is that even the debate about associative learning in plants is not really a debate based on good premises, because both the original experiments and the replication seem to be problematic. And then what Paco and the others of the team are trying to do is to replicate so they are doing 3 replications. So the first 2 are exact replications of Gagliano and colleagues and Merkel, and they're doing a conceptual replication where they implement the changes that they propose in the paper. So, and those paper, and another interesting thing of this paper is that most criticism of Gagliano were focused on statistical problems. I mean, the group was very small, the significance was not very high, etc. And they actually found problems with the design of the experiment. So problems have to do with the crafting of the devices, with how you plant the seeds, and also another interesting thing that actually is interesting for me as a teacher of philosophy of science, that those problems you don't find them until you try to replicate the experiment, and then you go to a lab and then you see, wait, but why didn't do this? So until you go and put your hands into the experiment, that you find those problems. So again, the proposal is that associative learning could be a reliable predictor of sentience, maybe with other elements. And then we still have to discuss whether plants are able to of associative learning or not. Another interesting example is anesthesia. So we know that plants endogenously produce anesthetics when stressed, and they are able to respond. So they respond also to anesthetics that are administered from outside. So first of all, we know that we can anesthetize a venous flytrap, so the snapshotting behavior stops. We can do the same with mimosa pudica. So we can anesthetize those plants so they stop responding to physical stimuli. And actually, you can monitor the electrophysiological activity, and you see how it decreases a lot. So you almost kill the plant, and you leave it alone for some hours, and it wakes up. So you see anesthetic response in plants too. And then, following this idea, Baluska and Yokawa have suggested that since anesthesia in humans induce a loss of awareness, this could also be the case for plants. Well, Marco agrees with this and is trying to investigate anesthetics in plants as a reliable way to investigate sentience. But I think there are actually good counter arguments to this. This quote from a paper, recent paper from Chris Dolega and colleagues that is actually published as a response to our commentary to our paper that now we have to reply. And they said, well, this kind of intervention, so administering anesthetics, lacks the selectivity that is needed to distinguish between targeting the mechanisms responsible for sentience and disrupting all behavioral and cognitive capacities. So basically, they say, well, you're basically knocking down the plants. But knocking down the plant per se doesn't show me much about sentience. So I don't really see how can I infer anything useful about sentience with this experiment. And I think they have a point. And again, also, you see that Baluska and Yukawa are actually making an anthropocentric analogy here. I say, well, if in humans, anesthesia induces a lot of awareness, maybe that's the same with plants. So this is, as I said, this is the state of the debate. So now the most promising avenues, I think, they are associative learning and anesthesia, and they are both very, very contested. So now I've reached the conclusions. I try to keep it brief because I'm a bit late for everyone, I think. So I think, and I stand by this claim, that adopting non-animal models for some plants, we can advance in the discussion about the nature of cognition and sentience. But I also say that much more research is needed, mostly about plant behavior and the mechanisms behind it. So I don't say plants are sentient, and I don't 100% fully agree with plants are cognitive. I think that we need more research about that. I also think that philosophers have much to say in comparative cognition. I think that we can play a role in this debate. For example, we can help define, so the choice that required to attribute a cognitive capacity C in any organism. So we can actually be there in design experiments. We can also clarify the meanings of our concepts. I think the example of sentience is a good example. Also, we can help analyze the empirical evidence, so we can try to see if it's conclusive, or it's driven by assumptions or unjustified analogies. And an example of this is this. So some months ago, this paper got published. Basically, what they did is that they induced or they created a very stressful dehydrating condition for plants. I don't remember species right now. Basically, they recorded uh, the physical reaction made by the stomata, I think it was, and they basically they lower the frequency enough, and plants make noises when they are dehydrated. However, it was covered by the media saying, well, research finds plants cry when stressed. Well, calm down, calm down. The only thing we have found is that not we, the researchers, is that there is a physical response that can be heard if enough transformation in the sound waves are made. To call that a crying is an unjustified leap, and it's an anthropocentric projection in my opinion. So these are the kind of things we have to avoid. These kind of things that we need to fight. Also, I think that philosophers should also strip themselves from anthropocentric and zoocentric biases about the nature of mind and cognition. We should be able to think that other species might have their own sentience profiles. Other species might have their own responses that don't indicate sentience for us because we have our own preconception about what should be a reliable predictor. Then I think I stand also by the quote by Andrews that we should be able to imagine those responses. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. So that's all for me. I hope the presentation was coherent. So I tried to do my best with the time I had.